The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 9th chapter. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the Beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen, until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. The Gospel of the Lord. The second reading for this weekend from 2 Corinthians has a very interesting phrase in which Paul speaks about veiling the gospel. And I got to thinking about the things that we veil. And oftentimes they're things that we find important, something that we want to hide from someone else. So in the Bible, there is a tradition, at least we hear, that the temple had a veil between the outer area and the holy spot where the tabernacle and the Ark of God were kept, so that the glory of the Lord was behind the veil and it was protected from the sight of other people. Some churches during Lent veil the cross to hide it while we are celebrating a darker time. And for a long time, there was a tradition that at weddings, the bride would wear a veil until she came into the sanctuary, and then as she was passed from father to husband, her veil would be lifted and her glory would be displayed to her new beloved to be. Veils cover things we find important. Sometimes we use blankets to do that. We hide things from kids at Christmas time and we put a blanket over it so they don't see the presents that are in the closet. Sometimes we cover things that are important so they don't get broken. We veil them. And typically what we have underneath that is something that we want to show off, but not right now. On the other hand, there are moments in which veils prevent us from seeing what's really there. We might not use the word veil the way Paul did. We might talk about somebody pulling the wool over our eyes. That something has covered our eyes in such a way that we can't see the reality around us. Someone's convinced us of something to such a degree that we are no longer able to perceive that there may be any other way of seeing the situation than the one which I come to the table with. We are blinded by our own perceptions, and someone needs to remove the veil before us. But whether it's a veil that's been placed there in order to protect the glory, or a veil that gets put there which prevents us from seeing the glory, God has come to unveil God's self. Yes, there are many times in which God reveals himself carefully. Throughout the scriptures, God finds ways to let us see a glimpse of his glory, but not all of it. There's a story in the book of Exodus when Moses is on the mountain and asks to see the glory of God, and God passes past Moses, but after he puts him on a rock so he can't see a whole lot, lest he be completely destroyed. And in the story we had earlier, in the reading from Kings, when we heard about Elijah going home and Elisha coming along, Elijah tries every which way to prevent Elisha from seeing him ascend into heaven, because then he would see the glory of God, and that might be more than Elisha could handle. And yet in the end, Elisha is there, and he recognizes the glory that he sees. And then on the Mount of Transfiguration, obviously for Peter, James, and John, they see a hint of who Jesus really is. Yes, they had thought that Jesus was something special, but here on the mountain, there was no longer any confusion about Jesus' identity. He was transfigured before them, and they saw him in all of his glory. And then again, it was veiled until the final glory revelation at his resurrection. Paul says that the good news of Jesus comes to those who have been veiled, not by God to prevent them from seeing the glory, but by the false narratives that prevents them from recognizing God's good news for all humanity. Paul says that we who proclaim the good news are to do so in such a way that we help to break through the veil that prevents people from seeing what God has in store for them. To proclaim in such a way that we break down the barriers so that people might see a glimpse of the glory until that day when God is ready to reveal all of his glory to all of his people. So whether we've covered up in order to keep the glory from showing too much, or whether we've been covered up by our inability to recognize God's glory around us and in the words from Jesus, we have become a people to whom God has revealed God's self in such a way that we might recognize the glory of God for the sake of the world.